Okay, so you'll have this in one of the upcoming chapters that you have to read, but what this all gets to is the notion of filters, is that we don't perceive reality objectively as it is. I believe that's my belief. I believe there's an objective reality out there. I believe that science does have somewhat accurate models of reality. But when it comes to human interactions, which is the topic of study of this class, you have to start to study the subjective aspects of reality. So when you try to understand how aesthetic judgment, ethical judgments, cultural judgments, you have to study the subjective. And then that means you have to start to understand how do we filter reality? What are those filters that we apply to reality? And how are they different from one person to another? What are your filters, and how are they different from other people's filters? That's going to be a key part of what we're going to learn in this class. You will be the object of study. So you're going to devote a lot of time studying yourself, your own psychology, meaning your own filters. Like some of them we share. We're all human beings here. So evolutionary psychology gives us some clues about what are some universal filters we share. Now, it makes some difference based on gender. You will say men don't perceive reality exactly the same way that women do, especially in terms of mate selection. So, but in other ways, we react the same way. Culture, that's already starting to be a little more complex. We have some diversity here. We have people coming from slightly, from different cultures, different subcultures within the US, or different national cultures. So that's already a source of difference. Now, you have even more different types of filters. We all have different parents, and our parents have different ideological beliefs. They come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They have different life stories. We grew up in different towns, different parts of the world, some big towns, some small towns, some rich neighborhoods or less rich neighborhoods. We have had different friends. We went to different schools. We have a whole life. All of us have had a different life. I found this very interesting for myself. I have an identical twin brother, so I shared that at the beginning of the class, so, which means that I share the same genes as he does. So we have the same genetics. And we also have the same family. We have the same parents. And we also went through the same developmental stages at the same time. So we went to school at the same age. We had the same kind of life milestones that we went through at the same time. And we exchanged a lot during that time. So we developed a very similar outlook on life up to a certain point. When we were in the same school until we were 19. Then we both went to business school, but we went to different business schools. And then I went to Portugal and the US, and he stayed in Europe, and we picked different professions, and I started living in the US and developing, adopting another culture. And we've gone very different ways. So I've seen how, with different trajectories in life, how our worldview has become very different. To the point that even though we still share the same original trunk of experience, we've really branched out in different ways, right? So it's a very interesting way to see how our psychology and filters change based on the choices you make and the environment you're exposed to, the type of people you hang out with. So one key aspect of concept that I like to emphasize is the notion of worldview, which I have here, worldview. And I use this in a particular way. So I don't mean by your worldview your political beliefs or your ideological beliefs or your cultural beliefs. What I mean by worldview, your worldview, the way I define it, is the overarching filter or set of filters that you use to make sense of reality. So each of us have a different worldview, meaning that the worldview is what allows us to understand what is an opportunity and what is a threat, what does that situation mean for me, and we all interpret it slightly differently. So what I like to say is we have 16 students plus me, that's 17 people in this class. I should not touch that mic. So we have 17 different people, and that means that 17 different classes are happening at the same time. So not one of us is experiencing exactly the same moment. We each interpret it slightly differently. The meaning that certain words have for you are all a little bit different. The meaning of certain of the images that put there all have slightly different reactions to them. Right? So your filters are slightly different. We all have slightly different filters. Now we hope that we somewhat on the same page, through language, English language, and through some common memory, some common theories, but we all have slightly, sometimes vastly different interpretation of the same theory, the same sentence. So that's all a product of your worldview. So this is a model, this is my attempt at summarizing different fields of psychology and explain how that happens. So you have reality out there, which you filter. And then, you perceive that reality, you have particular different motivations, different emotions. And then you have thought, which I call cognition. And you have impulsive or intuitive actions, and that, that produces your behavior. But I would say, even though, so you have a theory called the rational actor theory that is privileged in fields like finance and economics. Right? If you've taken an economics class, probably you've heard about utility maximization, right? Utility maximization. The idea is, how do we make economic decisions like consumption? How do we decide to buy something? We make a calculation of how much utility will it bring me. Might be conscious or unconscious. And we choose the consumption that will bring us the maximal utility, right? And the idea, at least in economics, is that we're rational, we're good optimizers. So, we decide, should I buy pasta or rice, and how much of it, what type of pasta should I, based on other stuff that I have going on in my life. And we make the best choice by reasoning about it. Now, how often do we actually do that? I would say, not very often. You go to the supermarket and you don't think about, how do you optimize my utility? And I'll make my, consumption choices based on that. You rarely do that when you select a mate. You go to a party, you decide, who's your, admitting you're single. How do you decide who you're attracted to? You don't utilize, you don't maximize your. Sometimes, some of us get calculative, when it's time to get married or something. But usually, you don't, usually you just follow your attraction, your intuition, right? While there are some actions that are reasons, we sometimes make reasoned action. There's a whole host of other actions that are then automatic pilots that have to do with our worldview. Our worldview is what is the filter that allows us to understand the meaning of a situation and take action. Your worldview is, to a large extent, unconscious. Like when I was asking you, when you answered earlier about where you decide to put your attention, and you said, when I sit on a table in a classroom, I know that I'm supposed to pay attention to what the professor is saying in the screen, right? Even though that's not always true. Sometimes your attention veers to something else, your cell phone, or you zone out, right? You have other thoughts coming out. But that particular socialization that you have, that's not something that you consciously decide to do. That's something that is so ingrained in you. You've been so often, so long in school that you just know that that's where you have to put your attention on, right? You don't think back about when I was 4 years old and I went to preschool, I got reprimanded for, zoning out, and that's why I should pay attention. But you've internalized it. It's become unconscious, right? So our worldviews, all of the experiences that we've had in our lives, the way our parents interacted with us, the way our teachers interacted with us, the way our siblings interacted with us, good things and bad things that happened to us, all of that is integrated in our memory, but it's not consciously available to us at any time. We might, if we think about what happened in our past, remember certain events. But most of the time, they've just shaped us to react in certain ways unconsciously. Right? So For example, you might have grown up in a neighborhood where certain kinds of people were presented to you as a threat. Maybe you lived in a neighborhood with gangs, for example, and you learn to recognize, maybe your parents and your friends, and your other people led you to recognize this is the particular type of a gang member, maybe certain tattoos or certain ways of, certain clothes, certain ways of handling themselves, of walking, and you immediately recognize that person and you immediately experience fear and a conditioned reaction to move away, move to the other, to avoid interaction with that person. Right? So that's an example of how of an unconscious filter that's acquired early in life. On the other hand, certain kind of people you maybe have learned to trust, to think that those people are people to approach, certain kind of trustworthy, nice people, and you have a stereotype of what that looks like. Right? So stereotyping is an inherent part of our filters. I was mentioning earlier, we make judgments with stereotype. That's not a bad thing per se. That's essential. We cannot function without stereotyping, without simplifying. Stereotyping means that we have a map of reality that allows us to recognize certain cues in the environment that have meaning, and we have reactions to it. Now, where stereotyping becomes a problem, and we'll talk about that next class, is when they become rigid and when they're wrong. Like you might have grown up in a particular neighborhood, associate tattoos, with gangs. Now you move to Cal Poly, and tattoos are all the rage, and you continue to think that tattooed people are potentially dangerous, when in fact they might just be tattooed people, just happen to like that, They're not gang members. There's nothing dangerous about them, and you haven't updated your filter, right? So that's kind of like that's a problem with filters, when they become rigid and not flexible, and when they lead us to wrong conclusions when we change environments. What shapes our culture? Our worldview, the collective history of the environment we live in. So our parents, our culture, but also our personal history. So I talked about how your parents and your culture give you a lot of filters. But past that, you yourself, in your life, become your own free agents and have personal adventures that teach you certain lessons. So maybe regardless of what your parents tell you, your parents might tell you these type of people, don't associate with them, they're bad people, right? And at school, you become friends with them and you realize, they're not at all what my parents say they are, Or this thing that my parents always told me was really dangerous is not dangerous at all. Maybe you go to a different culture and you're like, whoa, people do things that way that I thought was not the good thing to do, and here they enjoy it, you have your own experience, and you start to, based on those experiences, good things and bad things happen. So you have pleasurable experiences, growing experiences, and you change your filters based on that. And then you have unpleasant experiences or failures that lead you to alter your filters as well. So there's a mixture of personal experience and collective wisdom passed on by your culture, and those shape your filters. The more individualized you become, or the more actualized you become, the less you rely on collective filters, and the more you rely on your personal filters. Part of growing up is growing out of your family and your culture and becoming your own person. So what's interesting when you look at worldview is that even though it's a very complex set of things, it constantly evolves. It's not static. As we grow in age, our worldview evolves. And there's even a field of psychology called developmental psychology that talks about stages of development. It started with Piaget. One of the founders was Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who studied children. He studied the development of intelligence in children and found that they tend to go through different stages. So what he would do is for example, give a problem to a child and ask them to solve it, and observe how they ask them to solve it aloud, to reason aloud. And what he would find is at different ages we have different types of logic that we use. There's also another researcher called KenWilber's. I think it's, I forget if the H is here or here. I think it's here, but KenWilber's, who studied moral development and also found that we go through different stages. So for example, let me give you an example of how KenWilber's determines that. Here's a situation. Your mother is dying of a curable illness. It can be cured by a medication that's very expensive and you can't afford it. Right? There's a pharmacy in your town that you decide to break into to steal the medication to save your mother. Right? So now explain to me, why did you do that? Why is that moral? Why is that moral to steal the medicine? Right? There's level 1 logic because I can get away with it. So I wasn't caught by the police, so I can get away with it, so it's moral. Right? That's level 1. You know? The children at certain points, very young children, if you put candy on the table and say, don't take the candy, and then leave the room, if they steal the candy, most likely they'll say, if I can get away with it, that's moral. Right? That's their level of moral development. The second level is conformity. You say, I do it because anybody would do it. So what other people do is what you can get away with, right? So you look for others' behavior to justify morally things. The third level is when you say it's moral because there's a higher, it's bad to steal, it's immoral to steal, but it's immoral to let my mother die. And I think that it's more important to save my mother than to not steal. So you create a hierarchy in your own mind of different ethical standards, and you decide that one is more important. You have your own hierarchy of ethical standards, and you solve. That's the third level. You're like, I know it's unethical what I did, but it's the most ethical thing you can do under the circumstances. That's post-conventional. Regardless of what if everybody said it was wrong to steal, I would still do it because I want to save my mother. That's more important. Right? So that's an idea of stages of development. So you have Piaget, KenWilber's, you have many other researchers that have looked at different stages of development. Here I come back to Wilber. KenWilber's has come up with this, I think it's, 8-stage model, which summarizes different kinds of models. And the idea is that we tend to go, as we age, through different stages of development, which are basic sets of rules and ways of thinking that influence our worldview. It's not exactly your worldview, but it's a certain orientation, ideology of your worldview, if you will. And the idea is that these two stages are very rare. So, not everybody goes to the higher stages, according to Wilber. We tend to stop at a certain stage. And he also, if we were going to get into that, it's very complicated. So if you're interested, I can give you references to follow that. But all I wanted to mention is that there is a tendency for us to go through stages, and the way we move from one stage to another is happens in punctuated equilibrium fashion. So in evolutionary theory, this is a concept borrowed from evolution. So the original formulation of evolution by Darwin is that species tend to evolve to adapt themselves to their environment, right? To maximize their survival in a particular ecological niche or environment. And they have random mutation that occur, and if a random mutation genetic mutation leads to better survivability, maximization of the gene pool, then that gets selected for the next population, right? And that's how we have slow changes. So, for example, this leads to the question: how did birds develop wings, right? How did fish get out of water and evolve their fins to be limbs, right? It's kind of like mind-boggling to think about that. How did we develop eyes? How did we develop the senses we have? In some, you find animals now, for example, that used to have eyes, but they live in caverns in darkness where eyes have no value because you don't have light, and they de-evolve their eyes. Their eyes disappear. So because it doesn't provide any additional survivable benefit. So that's kind of like the traditional formulation is it happens in a slow way, as random mutation occur. But when you look at the actual fossils that we find, you find that it doesn't have, so the linear sort of view of evolution would be like that, right? Now it's, this is time, right? And this is kind of like fundamental like changes in our morphology and all that. But what we find in reality is that it doesn't quite happen like that. Instead, the way evolution tends to happen is like that. So you have a species that stays pretty much the same for quite a while, and then for a relatively short period of time, like this might be like 2 million years, right? And then during a relatively short time, like maybe like I don't know 20,000 years, which is relatively short, right? You have radical shifts where the species changes or develops a new capacity, and then you have stability again for a while. And it happens in fits and starts like that, right? The same is true for our, according to Wilber and other developmental psychologists, with our worldviews. So we tend to develop a fairly stable worldview until we have a major leap. Now think about teenage years, right? Your teenage crisis, right? You're a child, you have a fairly stable child worldview, and then puberty hits, and all kinds of change happen to your body and to your way of thinking, and you become an adolescent, right? Which is essentially kind of a young adult. So these short, very, very difficult years, a lot of change happens. And then, you come on the other side as a young adult, right? And you have a stable new version of yourself. And then, you might have another change, maybe after college, or maybe after college going to work, maybe like, getting married and having children, You might have, then there's the crisis of the 50s, right? Or the 40s, Then there's, retirement and the emptiness, Those might be like the different kind of like critical moments in a person's life where your worldview evolves, Maybe getting divorced, maybe having a serious illness, maybe having a huge drawback, losing somebody that's close to you, being dumped by somebody you're very much in love with, having a near-death moment, So we have a few key experiences in our lives that can propel us into completely revising our worldview. They can be aha experiences where we're like, wow, just realized something amazing about that I never thought about. I had a realization, and you have your different worldview. So I mean, there's two ways to see it. One way is to see it as a progression. KenWilber's sees this as a progression. The idea that we become more wider in our awareness, more evolved, right? Others say, well, it's not really like hierarchical like that. It's just that it's more like that. It's more like we tend to change our worldviews, and one worldview is not better than another. It's just different. I'm not sure. I mean, I tend to believe in the hierarchical view. If I look at my own experience, the idea is that for KenWilber is that each one of those stages includes the other ones. So when you're at this stage, you have a new capacity for seeing reality in a different way, but you still have these other stages available to you. You still can perceive reality in those stages. So that's how it would be hierarchical. I find this stuff fascinating and very interesting, and that's all I'm going to say for now. So in your self-reflection paper, which is a very important assignment of this class, what you're going to do is explore your worldview. So you're going to look at your filters. And how do you do that? Mainly, you're going to look at your history. So I'm going to ask you, I'll tell more about that. It's very hard to explore your own psychology your own filters. Why? Because your filters are invisible to you. One way to see it is the water for the fish. There's a joke that goes like this: two teenage fishes are swimming in the ocean, and they meet an old wise fish, and the old fish asks them, "How's the water?" And they keep swimming, and after a while they look at each other. It's like, what is he talking about? They don't know what water is. They've never had the experience of not being in water, so it's just been the environment around them. The old fish maybe has seen the atmosphere, has jumped out of the water, has experienced non-water. So your worldview is, for most of us, we tend to think that our worldview is reality. We tend to mistake reality for our worldview. So we tend to be in an objectivist stance, that I am objective, I am sane, therefore, and I perceive reality as it is. I don't have subjectivity. I'm smart and rational and logical, and therefore I'm right. And my filter, my models of reality are accurate. So we don't tend to think about our filters. What I'm inviting to do is I'm kind of contesting that and saying, well, you have subjectivity, you have filters. Reality is not, hopefully, reality is somewhat, approximately how you coincides with your models of it. But your filters are also involved, and they are your source of your own subjectivity. You might think of it as bias. That's a negative view to see it. Or you might think of it as your own richness, your own idiosyncratic personality, who you are, how you're different from others. So I'm going to ask you to explore that. And part of it will involve describing your life story and key events that occurred to you, and how your parents were, what your culture was like, and how you felt all about it.